Hello, this is S.K. Williams. I am using my poor microphone, and that's because I have to. You see, it is Easter time again, and I wanted to do a video on the origin of Easter, which is discussed online constantly every year. In fact, sometimes it's discussed even when it is not Easter, so it's a good time to talk about it myself. This is especially true since I have already done a video on the origin of Christmas, and in that video I did promise a follow-up on the origin of Easter. Now, the Christmas video was not very long. This was because I actually was recovering from surgery, had to catch up on schoolwork that I missed when I was preparing for the surgery, and had to deal with other issues as well as holiday-related events. All of which conspired to prevent me from sitting down and making a long video where I cited numerous sources to back up my claims. This isn't the case with Easter. I had plenty of time and opportunity to write out a nice, detailed film. But I like being a completist, and I would like to do another video on the origin of Christmas, which is longer. And I don't really want to do a long one on the origin of Easter, then do the Christmas one, since the birth of Christ comes before the death and resurrection of Christ. So, for the sake of equilibrium, this will also be a short video, and I intend, God willing, to do longer ones next year, or rather this year for Christmas. In Christmas of 2018, I will do a long video on the origin of Christmas, and next year, 2019's Easter, will see me doing a long one on the origin of Easter. This is basically a preliminary video for that. So a bit apropos, since it is going to be the 1st of April, which Easter falls on. Perhaps it would have been better, considering how ostentatious this is, to do the longer video, but, like I said, I am a completist. With all that said, I shall commence with the topic of the video now. Well, with the introductions out of the way, we can commence. I'm certain everyone is familiar by now with the Christian holiday of Easter. And I am quite certain that, considering you're on the internet watching this video, you are also familiar with the true origins of Easter as a pre-Christian pagan holiday, although the details are muddled, with some people claiming that it goes back specifically to the British Isles with the goddess Eostre, a Germanic or Brittonic goddess of spring and fertility, and others take it back to the Norse, perhaps, and it is very common to see it going back all the way to Babylon with the worship of the goddess Ishtar, and how Ishtar's name got corrupted. It was Ishtar's Day, Ishtar's Day, Ishtar, Easter, Easter. You see? It works because it sounds similar. Of course, with the latter one, it's purely based on a phonetic similarity, not an actual justifiable link. But it's one that plenty of people have heard of and made, and the first one I shall dispense with. Easter is, in absolutely no way, connected to the goddess Ishtar. In all accounts of the origin of the name Easter, it comes strictly from the British Isles, and Ishtar was simply never worshipped in Britain. With that said, the common story that is told about the origin of Easter, the one that you find routinely online if you are not using Hislop's idea of Ishtar and all the gods being basically Semiramis, is the Christian Church either attempted to make it easier for pagans to convert to Christianity, or wished to make it easier for pagans who had converted to Christianity to remain within the faith comfortably by adopting a pagan holiday, or rather several. and simply rechristening them and rebranding them as Christian holidays, giving them new meaning. This is the subject, of course, of much criticism as well, especially today in a world where we criticize cultural appropriation. But much like how Christmas is claimed to be Saturnalia or some other holiday, which pagans already celebrated and Christians decided to call the birth of Christ, Easter is said to be a spring fertility ritual and is either specifically a celebration of the spring equinox, or more specifically, of the goddess Eostre, the goddess of spring and fertility and vitality, who ushers in the spring holiday. She was, of course, the origin of many of the Easter customs we are familiar with, such as the Easter bunny and Easter eggs. It is commonly asked, what do those things have to do with Jesus? This is a rhetorical question, of course, because the answer is nothing. They're a pre-Christian pagan symbol. The egg is a symbol of fertility, and thus the symbol of Eostre, the goddess of fertility. And the rabbit is also a symbol of fertility, and that's why we have them. They are pre-Christian pagan leftovers that Christianity didn't eliminate. They are obvious links to the pagan past. And how can you argue otherwise? It's clear that they're pagan. But is it? You see, as with Christmas, if you had seen my previous video, the claims of the obvious pagan origins of Easter and its customs are greatly exaggerated. In reality, Easter was simply not a pagan holiday. That probably comes as no shock to you to hear me say that, if you had actually seen the Christmas video, or for that matter, if you had just seen my introduction, you probably know the direction this is going. And I also already know the accusation that I am a Christian, and I just can't stand that my religion stole other people's holidays, or that my religion has pagan DNA, or that I just can't let go of it emotionally. I have this emotional connection to Easter and need it to be Christian, so I'm going to lie to you. Please don't accuse me of that. I grew up in the Churches of Christ. Not the United Churches of Christ. The Churches of Christ. The ones that do not play musical instruments because there is no warrant for it in Scripture. This is important because the Churches of Christ do not celebrate Easter. Individual members may do so as a secular holiday, but the church itself actually does not celebrate I did not grow up celebrating Easter in a church setting. We did not have special Easter services. We did not hand out Easter baskets at church, or have egg hunts in churchyards, or have a special service in which we had some sort of liturgy in which we remembered Christ. We had nothing whatsoever. In fact, most churches of Christ go out of their way to avoid this. Granted, you can't really avoid the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ in a church, because that's what it is about, but there were no really special Easter sermons. It was a regular sermon, and quite often some people would be so averse to even the hint of celebrating Easter that they would actually preach from the Old Testament on those Sundays, or some other unrelated lesson about morality, with no specific connection to the holiday. And as for my mother, she did buy me Easter baskets. My father had passed away, so he was no longer in the picture. My mother did buy us Easter baskets, and we had a little fun with certain things like that, but it was really not that special to me. I mean, it was special to me in that it was a celebration, but it wasn't really this deep emotional connection. I have no reason whatsoever, based on my background, to reject the truth of Easter's pagan origins. In fact, I used to actually tell people that Easter had a pagan origin. I freely admitted it. I admitted that the Christian church, or at least the Catholic Church, took pagan holidays and converted them to Christian ones. I freely admitted that. I admitted the truth. So, what caused me to lie now? Why do I reject the obvious, historically backed truth that Easter is a pagan holiday and decide to lie now? Did I convert to some other form of Christianity and want to support my new church? No, that's not it. What happened was that I learned history. And learning history does many things to dispel very popular notions of history. Much like how learning about the American Revolution pretty well undermines all the heroic talk about it, or learning about some of the less reputable events in World War II makes it far more gray, even though that is the closest we get to a clear good versus evil war. Learning things about history will often eradicate common myths. And as with other myths concerning the history of Christianity, this one isn't really that old. It only goes back to the 19th century. And it's not because the 19th century scholars discovered the truth of Easter that had been long buried. It was largely a reconstruction. In the 19th century, it became popular to talk about the origins of religions in the context of evolutionary ideas that were very primitively understood at the time. This was an era in which social Darwinism was being developed, an idea in which you could actually engineer cultures. This was a world in which eugenics was discussed without people recoiling in horror because Nazi Germany had not come along. Darwin's theory of evolution had actually captivated some people's imagination to the point where they tried to apply it to literally everything. Simultaneous to this was the free thought movement, which sought to revive the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ideas, contrary to a lot of people's popular notion, did not start in the 18th century and continue onward forever. They actually lost favor around the 1810s. People had grown weary of this philosophy since it was connected to violent, bloody revolutions. In fact, even in the United States, which was the first revolutionary republic created on Enlightenment ideology, people had already decided that the ideas were just too blood-drenched. They were abandoned. Some people still held a candle for the Enlightenment, but its ideas weren't really quite as influential as they used to be, until around the 1860s and 1870s, when some people decided to revive them. But as with every revival, they didn't just take the old ideas and copy them verbatim and develop them from there. They took their modern cultural ideas and modern philosophical ideas from their own time period and incorporated them into the philosophy of the Enlightenment, all while reinterpreting the Enlightenment ideals through their own cultural backdrops. And the same thing happened with evolution, to an extent, like I had said earlier, but in this context, it became very popular to imagine that Christianity must have gotten started from previous religions and evolved from there. This made sense both in the context of the evolutionary model that they were trying to apply to everything, and to the concept of the Enlightenment, in which religion is man-made and somewhat of a restrictive force in terms of Christianity. Keep in mind, in the 19th century, the people who followed the free thought movement did not talk like modern militant atheists in the New Atheist movement. In fact, they hadn't quite vilified the term religion yet. It is certainly true that they had, in many circles, vilified Christianity, but they were openly calling their own beliefs the new religion. They in no way saw their own beliefs as not being religious. In fact, even the atheists in the free thought movement, who made up a large percentage and toward the peak of it made up the majority, did not really see themselves as non-religious. They didn't define religion, as atheists today will, using the Oxford English Dictionary because they have to, as belief in a god are supernatural powers and higher powers controlling us. They had no qualms about calling themselves religious. They did not revile the word religion. But they did want a new religion, one based on reason and science. And during this time period, you had plenty of people who were actually Christian who had embraced some of the elements of the free thought movement as well, especially in the liberal Christian movement. And please don't think liberal means the same thing quite as today. It's not purely political. And it's in this context that the idea of Easter being a pagan holiday came about. With one final key that I forgot to mention that I will rapidly. This was a time period in which, while Catholics had been emancipated in Britain and were largely tolerated in America, were still broadly distrusted and disliked, and heroic tales of the Protestant Reformation were still ongoing. So, you combine all these factors, a desire to apply evolutionary models to literally everything, a desire to undermine Christianity in some quarters of the world, a desire to undermine specifically Catholicism in others, and a desire to be enlightened enough to admit the truth of things, and you get a maelstrom which produced many interesting myths. For never are we more susceptible to believing in myths than when we have decided to kid ourselves about how enlightened we are for discovering the truth. Quite often, the truth is nothing but contrarian beliefs to tradition, and we become so arrogant that we blind ourselves to the fact that these are our mere ideas, insisting that they are, in fact, the truth. And myths they are. Everything within the narrative that says that Easter was originally a pagan holiday is entirely wrong. Even the claim that the things we use to celebrate Easter, such as eggs and bunny rabbits being obvious pre-Christian symbols, isn't actually true. And you may think that that sounds very insane. I mean, it's obvious they're pagan. The rabbit is a symbol of fertility that the pagans used, and the egg is an obvious symbol of fertility. Pagans used that to represent fertility. Everyone knows this, and it is so blatantly obvious. But let me ask you this. Is it blatantly obvious that Christians are using pagan symbols so that when you look at these symbols, you realize instantly they're pagan, and yet they're being used in Christian worships and services? Or do you associate them with paganism because you have been told for years that they are in fact pagan? And I would suspect it's the latter. Had no one ever told you that Easter was a pagan holiday and that these things came from paganism, the obvious connection wouldn't really be there. And that's kind of the point. A lot of the things that seem self-evident on the surface, that seem obvious, are obvious only because we know of the narrative. We do not know the narrative is true because the evidence leads us there, but rather we construct in our mind an interpretation of the symbolism that corresponds with the narrative that we already agree, and then use it to reinforce that narrative as evidence. That's not really the way we should do things. In fact, we should look at things more logically and with the actual evidence at hand. So what evidence is there? And that is where the entire narrative collapses. For you see, there really isn't any evidence at all of Easter being a pre-Christian pagan holiday, and the evidence we do have contradicts the notion. Now, don't get me wrong, there is one piece of evidence which is generally used to prove that it is pagan. But it really doesn't, and if you look upon it yourself, you will see this is the case. That piece of evidence is from the Venerable Bede, who is the only source of information for the Pagan Origins of Easter. I don't mean he's the only person who is saying it, but all of the 19th century authors trying to reconstruct the origin of various Christian customs and beliefs had to look at Bede as their only anchor into this theory, for he is the only voice of antiquity who gave any testimony regarding this topic. There are no ancient records whatsoever from any other source about the supposed pagan holiday. So, what did Bede say? Well, as you can read on the screen now, he gave this text. The only text with which this theory hinges. And I shall read it now. Easter month has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. And that's it. That is the total sum of what Bede had said. And if you read it carefully, without the bias of assuming that this is an admission that the Christian Church took a pre-existing pagan holiday, then you realize something strange about this text in terms of that theory. It says Easter month was named after the goddess Eostre, and in Easter month, the feasts, plural, were held in honor of the goddess Eostre. But they now call it the Paschal month, and they now call the Paschal season by the name of the month in which it falls in, and hence by the goddess. In other words, what was actually happening wasn't that the church saw pagans celebrating a holiday and adopted it and gave it a new Christian meaning. Rather, when Britain was Christianized, the people of Britain had their own calendar, and one of the months was named Easter month. And in that month, they used to worship and honor a goddess named Eostre with many feasts. But once they converted to Christianity, they, of course, began celebrating Pascha, which is the other word for Easter, by the way. And because it fell in the month of Eostre, they were using a similar lunar calendar, they started calling the holiday Easter, or Ostern, or Easter, after the month it fell in. It's not actually saying that the Christian holiday originated from the worship of Eostre. It's not even saying it's named after it, but rather the people called the holiday after the name of the month, which happened to be named after the goddess. It's really not the same thing as saying it is a pagan holiday, now is it? And that's sort of the main problem that most people don't realize. It may be common knowledge that Easter was originally a pagan holiday named after Eostre, and that she was a pagan goddess, and her sacred animal was the hare or rabbit, and her sacred symbol was the egg, but we don't actually have any evidence of any of that. We don't even really have evidence that Eostre was a goddess of fertility or of spring, and all of these claims that are being made are completely invented. Indeed, the only real source we have of any information on Eostre is Bede. So all that talk about how she was a very popular goddess, she was the great mother goddess, perhaps she was the highest goddess of the pantheon, has no basis. There is no basis for claiming that the hare or rabbit was her symbol, or that the egg was her symbol. And most damning of all, some of the things that we say were associated with her that the Christians took over couldn't have possibly been so. What I mean by that is this. Look at the Easter Bunny. It is supposed to be a throwback to pre-Christian pagan times. The hare or rabbit, which breeds quite often, especially in spring, is associated with the fertility goddess Eostre, and that's why it is ubiquitous in Easter. But it's not. The Easter Bunny is of Germanic origin. Germans have the Easter Bunny, and cultures that are somehow deeply connected to Germany have the Easter Bunny. Britain has the Easter Bunny. The United States has the Easter Bunny. I believe Austria also has it, but don't quote me on that one. But France doesn't. Spain doesn't. Italy doesn't. The Easter Bunny is not really a universal Easter custom. And while eggs are, they seem to have come from the 13th century, and they don't seem to predate Christianity. And the biggest piece of evidence used to prove that Easter was once pagan is the name itself, Easter. But even that's a problem, because while in English it is Easter, and in German it is Ostern, in no other language does it even remotely resemble this. Almost every language in Europe either refers to the holiday as Pascha, or refers to it as some variant of Pascha like Pascus or Paskia, and all of those mean Passover. Most languages do not refer to this holiday as Easter, so even that connection to Eostre is severed. And now some of you may say, well, fine, they don't call it that, but that was the original name of the holiday, and English just happens to be one of the few languages that preserves the original name. But there's no evidence of that. Do you know what we do have evidence of? We have evidence of Christians celebrating the resurrection of Christ at Passover, going back to the early 2nd century AD. And the attestation we have from actual documents say that it was an established custom, so it probably goes back to the 1st century AD. In fact, Easter is really just a continuation of the Jewish Passover. So if Christians got the holiday from anyone, it would be from the Jews, which is not surprising, as Christianity emerged from Judaism and is largely based upon it. In fact, some have argued that it is just a form of Judaism, although I wouldn't necessarily go that far. It is still deeply connected, so it's not really theft, it is just part of its own heritage. Easter is Passover, and it's always been connected to Passover. Jesus Christ was killed at Passover time, he resurrected around Passover time, and the Passover of the Old Testament is linked directly to the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And we have no such connection with pagans. And when you add to this the fact that Christians tended not to really incorporate pagan things into their culture, and how contradictory the narrative is, with Christians going to pagan villages with armies and saying, "Convert or die!" and actually carrying out their threats by slaughtering all the pagans who refuse to convert. Well, if that's true, why didn't they just kill the pagans who celebrated Easter? Of course, that's not true either. The story of how Christianity was violent and brutal is largely mythological. But it begs the question, if Christians made it a common practice to incorporate pagan customs into their own celebrations or into their own faith, why is it we have no evidence? I will elaborate on this topic next year. I intend on doing a longer Christmas video, like I said, and a longer video involving this. But for now, I shall leave it at this. Easter was not a pagan holiday originally. It was a Christian holiday, and at best you can say Jewish because it is Passover. You really can't justify the pagan claims. There is no documentation, and all of the claims we have are fake. don't really have much else to say. So I suppose this concludes the video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you have a happy Pascha, Easter, Resurrection Sunday, whatever you call it. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.